What's up guys, Edrone here. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the new HDZero goggles and doing some analog testing. Stay tuned. We're going to be taking the new HDZero goggles, we're going to be updating the firmware on these goggles, and going to be comparing the analog to before the firmware update, after the firmware update, as well as comparing the firmware to my older HDO2s with the same analog bay. We're using the Immersion RC Rapid Fire for this testing, as well as the SpiroNet patch, and the Lumineer Axie double antenna is going to be on the Rapid Fire module. As far as what analog system we're going to be using for this test, we're going to be flying my Sub250 Nanofly16 for this test. This is going to be the little quadcopter that we're going to be flying around. Any performance upgrades from doing the firmware updates, as well as comparing the analog to my HDO2s versus these new HDZero goggles with the new de-interlacing. So in order to go ahead and get the firmware updated on these new goggles, we're going to go ahead and walk you through it step by step. And I'm going to go ahead and show you exactly what we need to do. First of all, we need to go ahead and pick our micro SD card. The micro SD card I'm going to be using for this demonstration is a 32 gigabyte SanDisk. Now, what you want to go ahead and do first of all is go ahead and take the micro SD card and put it in the goggles and go ahead and format the micro SD card in the goggles. You can also do this on the computer. Just make sure wherever you format the micro SD card, you format it to FAT32. That is the proper formatting you're going to want to use for the micro SD card when you're going to go ahead and update the firmware. All right, we're going to be updating the firmware on the goggles first. Now, you can definitely download the firmware to the goggles and the firmware to your VTXs, but I just want to do it one at a time to just eliminate any confusion and keep this as simplistic as possible so that you don't make any mistakes. All right. We've got our micro SD card formatted in the goggles. Go ahead and take that micro SD card. Go ahead and put that in your adapter to go ahead and plug into your computer. Now for this, I'm going to be using this adapter here, and I'll put links in the description for everything you see in this video. This is a USB-C micro SD card. It also has the SD card slot as well as USB. And we're going to go ahead and plug the micro SD card into this adapter here. We're going to go ahead and plug it into the PC. Now, you're going to want to go ahead and go to the HDZero website. I'll put the website link down below. Go ahead and go to the support tab here. Go ahead and click on the download. And once you get into the download section, you're going to look for the HDZero goggle firmware. Now, you're looking for the newest firmware that's on here. And you can see by the release date here, that's how they have the firmware labeled. Go ahead and click on that firmware and double click on that, and it's going to go ahead and install that to your computer. Now I'm using Windows. If you're using anything different, this video is not really going to be much help. But if you're going to be using Windows, this video will help you through this. All right, so now once you have the firmware downloaded on your PC, go ahead and download and unzip that bin file to a spot on your PC that you will be able to remember and find later. Now go ahead and click on the bin file for the HDZero goggles. And this is the correct version here. Ignore all these other firmwares that you see. This is going to give us all the firmware for the HDZero goggles, the emergency recovery firmware, as well as all of the different VTX firmwares. I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the HDZero bin file, and I'm going to copy this bin file. Now we're going to go ahead and go over to our micro SD card and going to go into the root directory of the micro SD card. We're going to right-click and save it. Now we've got the bin file for the HDZero goggle saved to the micro SD card. Go ahead and safely eject the micro SD card. Take that same micro SD card and put it back into the HDZero goggles. Now, unlike previously with the SharkBite and HDZero VRX, we can go ahead and power up the goggles, and the firmware is not going to update yet. Go ahead and power on the goggles. Now, once you're in the menu system, go ahead and scroll down, and we can select the firmware and update goggles. Now, while this is updating, please make sure you've got a fully charged battery plugged into the goggles. You don't want the goggles to the battery to die while updating the firmware, as well as make sure that the goggles don't come unplugged. Make sure the power switch doesn't turn off. You definitely want the goggles to be powered up during the entire duration of the firmware flash. Now, once the firmware has been flashed, you should get a successful flash. Go ahead and repower the goggles now, and now your firmware is all up to date on your HDZero goggles. Now it's time to go ahead and get the firmware downloaded on the micro SD card that we're going to use to flash VTXs. Now for this demonstration, we're going to be flashing the HDZero 1-watt Freestyle VTX. So go ahead and take the micro SD card back out of the goggles. We're going to go ahead and put that back into our micro SD card reader and going to stick that back into the computer. Go ahead and find that file you downloaded from the HDZero goggle and go ahead and open that up. And now you're going to look for whatever VTX you have that you want to flash. Go ahead and find it. We're going to be using the 1-watt Freestyle VTX. We're going to go ahead and right-click on the bin file, copy that file. We're going to save that bin file onto the micro SD card in the root directory of the micro SD card, just like we did for the goggle firmware. Now, just to leave out confusion, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the HDZero goggle firmware is deleted off the micro SD card. So all we have on this micro SD card is going to be for the VTX firmware, just to eliminate any confusion. All right, now we've got the firmware for the VTX saved on a micro SD card. Go ahead and eject the micro SD card safely from your computer. We're going to go ahead and put the micro SD card back into the HDZero goggles. Now we're going to go ahead and connect the firmware flashing cable. The one I'm using in this demonstration is a little bit longer than the one you're going to get with your goggles, and I'll put a link to that down below. This one was an extra long cable that I happened to find a little while back, and it makes it a little bit more convenient when you're hooking up your goggles to your VTXs to update firmware. All right, take your little tweezers, and I use these little round tip tweezers so I don't accidentally poke a wire. You're going to want to make sure you push in on the firmware update cable in the goggles to make sure it's plugged all the way in. You want that cable to be plugged in securely. You'll feel a little bit of resistance when you have it plugged in all the way. That way you know it's plugged in securely. And now we can go ahead and take the other end, and we're going to go ahead and plug that end into the firmware update slot on your VTX. And for this one, we're doing the 1-watt Freestyle VTX. So go ahead and make sure that's plugged in securely as well. Now, once you have the firmware flashing cable plugged into your VTX, you do not need to apply any power whatsoever to the quadcopter. All we need to do now is power up the goggles. Okay? Once the goggles are powered up, you're going to scroll down through the menu system. You're going to go ahead and select Flash Firmware to VTX. We're going to go ahead and select Flash VTX. And this actually worked really fast for me. Go ahead and select Flash, and you will see it says Flashing Complete. Now you can go ahead and exit out of that menu. And what I like to do is power cycle the VTX. Go ahead and power cycle the VTX. Plug it back in. Go ahead and do your auto scan and make sure that your goggles pick up the signal coming from your VTX and that you have video on the screen and you know that you have flashed the firmware correctly and you've got everything you need to go ahead and get this connected. And now you have the newest firmware matching on your VTX as well as on your goggles. And what's really nice about these new goggles versus the VRX that we used to use is the actual firmware bin file actually stays on the micro SD card. So you only need to download that bin file one time on the micro SD card, and you can flash as long as it's the same VTX. You can go ahead and flash all your VTXs by just simply plugging them into the firmware update cable that's connected to your goggles, and then going through the menu and selecting Flash VTX for each and every one. And I must say, I really do like the new font that is included on these new HDZero goggles firmware. It has a really nice look for the font. It looks a little bit more new age, a little bit less retro, and I really like that it has a nice clean look to it. It's easy to see on this display. I really do like that feature. I'm going to put links down below for this monitor that you see here that we're using to go ahead and display everything you see. This is a really cool monitor that you can use, and I'm actually going to be making this into a portable little ground station where I'm going to take my older SharkBite VRX. I'm connecting it to this monitor so I can have this out in the field. And I can go ahead and use this monitor to go ahead and show other people while I'm flying. They can tune in and kind of see my flight and any other people that are flying HDZero. You can go ahead and lock on and everybody can do a little ride along, and you can have this monitor to go ahead and show people your flights. As well as, it's really nice when you're flashing your VTXs, because the firmware cable isn't really that long. It makes it a lot more convenient to have your goggles on the desk, have your cable connected to your quadcopter, and then go ahead and use this little video monitor to go ahead and go through the menu to flash your quadcopters. It just makes it a little bit easier. And I'll put links down in the description for the HDMI monitor that you see here. It can run off a 12 volt, so you can run it off a 3S LiPo. And I was able to run a 3S LiPo which ran the monitor and the SharkBite VRX, no issues whatsoever. Everything powered up, everything synchronized, and it worked really well. And the monitor was really not that expensive. It was like $60 on Amazon. Taking a look at the older firmware versus the newer firmware, basically looking to see any differences in signal overall, quality of the DVR. And I must say, it seems like after the firmware update, the colors seem to be a little bit more vibrant in the DVR. In the living room is where the most interference is going to be, because that is where our Wi-Fi router is. And overall, it seems that after the firmware update, the analog seems to have a little bit better signal overall. Seems to handle the breakup just a little bit better than before the update. Pay no attention to the solid lines you see here on the screen. I believe that is from the crossfire antenna, giving me a little bit of interference in my video. But I do think that there is a slight improvement in the actual performance of the analog receiver after the firmware update. But let me know what you think down in the comments. It doesn't appear to be a huge increase from this test, but I more or less notice it in the living room, around where that Wi-Fi router is. You will see that when I go in the living room before and after the firmware update, you get a little bit more static lines, a little bit more flashing before the firmware update versus after. So definitely seem to clean up the analog a little bit more after the firmware update. I think so. Okay, now this is the HDO2 DVR compared to the HDZero DVR, and I think there's a noticeable improvement over this for sure. You have the HDZero DVR, which obviously has the deinterlacer, so you're getting a much more clean look here on the video. You can see the colors look a little bit more vibrant, and overall the actual image itself just seems to be a little bit smoother when flying around, versus the HDO2 at times can seem a little bit more stuttery. But all in all, if you really pay attention to the details here, look at the details in the walls and the door frames, stuff like that, they seem to pick up a lot more detail with the HDZero deinterlacer. And overall, I actually prefer the image with the HDZero versus the HDO2. And as you can see, while there is a little bit of constant flickering on both, seems to be a little bit more with the HDO2. But I really am very happy with doing the firmware update with the image quality of the analog system. I'm able to see the gates and everything just fine, and I really like that it just seems to be a little bit more crisp. The details seem to be just a little bit more crisp. Seems a little bit softer with the HDO2. Alright, so there you have it. There's the comparisons between the analog systems using the HDO2s versus the HDZero goggle, and as well as doing a couple different comparisons with different firmware. I'll be anxious to see what you guys think. Go ahead and put your comment down below. All in all, I'm really happy with the new firmware update. It seems to make things a little bit smoother running, especially on the rapid fire in mode 1. So definitely recommend going ahead and doing that firmware update. Just follow the instructions step by step in this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and please like, share, subscribe. There's going to be more HDZero goggle content on the channel, so stay tuned for that. And until next time, guys, thanks so much for watching. Edrone out.